Hello, YouTube. An article came across my Twitter feed, and I thought it would make some nice conversation fodder. The title is #NotAllWhitePeople, the quiz, and it's written by someone who calls themselves Absurdist Words. And the key thing I want to point out is their description of themselves, which reads, "Fostering rational discussion on those difficult subjects that divide us." I'm going to take this person at their word and approach this article as though I'm addressing someone interested in having a rational discussion. So let's get started. It should go without saying that discussing racism is difficult. It's awkward and uncomfortable, and people often find themselves either talking past one another or retreating to their corners, never to meet again. I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad you haven't attributed this problem with discussing racism to one particular group or race, because I've seen that far too often for my liking. Over the past 2 years, I've devoted a significant amount of time to facilitating discussions about race on Twitter. I have learned, after watching and participating in thousands of these conversations, that one consistent sticking point is the assertion, white people are racist. I'll address that last part in a moment, but first I must say, in my experience, people who devote a significant amount of time talking about race tend to have a strong bias when it comes to that subject. They tend to view everything through the lens of race, and this can cause them to see things like racism and discrimination even where it does not exist. This is not a problem specific to the lens of race, of course, but in this case, I'm worried that you may have a strong bias. As for that last part, it's my view that the assertion, quote, white people are racist, is a sticking point because it's an assertion that places a negative label on an entire race. It uses no qualifying words like most or many, and in most of the cases I've seen, it's not an assertion people make that they're willing to have challenged. On top of that, the very act of accusing all members of race of being racist is arguably racist in itself. The ridiculousness of this and the hypocrisy it represents is another major reason, in my opinion, for the assertion being a sticking point. Because in America, we have come to think of racism only in terms of its extremes: slavery, Nazis, the KKK, Jim Crow, etc. When black people call out systemic racism, the average white person, not seeing themselves in any of these extremes, responds with defensiveness. This resistance to being considered complicit in systemic racism is exemplified by the Twitter hashtag #NotAllWhitePeople. This is a constant refrain to my discussions. I am exempt. I think there's some merit to the idea that most people prefer to think of racism in terms of its extreme examples. But I think if pushed, most people in America would at least prefer to think of racism as how it's described in the dictionary. The definition that comes up on Google, for example, is, quote, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. That seems to be essentially the definition most people agree with, and that's generally how the word is used. So when you say white people are racist, what most people hear is you accusing every single white person of engaging in prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism against people of a different race. If someone knows they haven't done any such thing and they're white, of course their natural reaction is going to be to point out that your claim is necessarily false since they're white and they're not racist by that definition. But see, like many people who have a bias on the topic of race, you just in this paragraph switched between the terms racism and systemic racism as if those terms have the exact same meaning. See, if you make the claim that white people contribute in at least some small way to systemic racism, then you're going to get a lot fewer replying with "not all white people." If you're constantly getting that as a reply, it's probably due to your phrasing. When talking about contentious issues, you have to choose your words carefully and be willing to define your terms clearly. If you don't do that, you're not likely to have productive conversations. But anti-blackness is deeply rooted in American culture, extending far beyond the most egregious examples of racist aggression. Racism manifests in laws, in advertisements, in economic policy, in media portrayals, in criminal justice, and in general society. We have all been steeped in it. and that you as a person have been unaffected by it is highly unlikely. See, here's the problem again. You introduced this article as being about racism in general, and you mentioned how difficult it is to have a discussion about racism, but then you commit some of the classic mistakes people make when discussing this topic. First off, once again, you've switched to using the term racism rather than systemic racism. Which one do you mean? It sounds like you mean systemic racism here, and if that's the point you're making, I might agree with you if you maybe just defined what qualifies as systemic racism. The other mistake you've made is to suddenly switch from talking about racism in general to talking about anti-blackness, as though black people have a monopoly on the topic of racism or something. If you still think that there's no way you're racist at all as a white person, here's a quick quiz. The questions aren't exhaustive and nobody is scoring you but you, so be honest with yourself and ask yourself if you can say no to all of the following. Okay, good. So these questions will give me some idea of how you define racism. I'll answer them, although I don't think I'm the target of your quiz, and I have no intention of revealing my race to you or anyone else. Have you ever presumed that a black person was less qualified for a skilled job than a white person? Certainly not purely on the basis of race, but I have seen cases where a white person was obviously more qualified than a black person for a skilled job, but that was due to their education, their skills, or demeanor, not just their race. But since you weren't clear in your question, I'd have to say yes, even though what I'm describing clearly isn't a case of racism by any definition of the word. Have you ever defended accusations of racism by invoking black friends? No, but I've seen plenty of people who have done this. The logic works like this. Since racism against black people is hatred of black people, a racist in theory would have no black friends. Since the person in question has black friends, they can't possibly be a racist. If somebody makes that argument, it tells you a lot about how they think about racism. And if you disagree with their definitions, you can use that as a good starting point to have a discussion about the topic. Have you ever laughed or poked fun at a characteristically black name like Letitia or Daquan? Maybe when I was younger. Some black football player names sound rather strange. But here's an issue with these questions. They're have you ever questions, meaning they refer to the past. So if I did this, say, 15 years ago, I'd have to answer yes, even though I haven't done it in the past 15 years. This means, according to this quiz, even though this is something I wouldn't do now, because I did it in the past, I am currently in the present a racist. How does that work exactly? To me, it seems like a cheap way to cause more people to answer yes to the questions. A more even-handed way of asking this would be to ask if you think these names are funny. That would bring the question into the present. Have you ever considered a black friend not really black? Yes, but only black friends who make that assessment of themselves, and even then, it's only a sort of in-joke. But this brings up an interesting point, which is the difference between being racially black and culturally black. That's where this not really black idea comes from. If you don't listen to the same music, watch the same movies, dress, or talk the same as most other black people, are you culturally black? It's a complex issue, since culture is not a solid, easily definable thing. But it's an interesting topic. Have you ever joked that you were blacker than your black friend because you engaged in more stereotypically black aesthetics, such as clothes, slang, or music? No, but I might if I did engage in stereotypically black aesthetics. That again would be playing on the idea of black culture, which is a concept promoted by many black people. The existence of things like BET are evidence of this. Have the terms welfare or poverty automatically brought up images of black people in your mind? No, not black people specifically. Not even people, always. It would depend on the context those terms were brought up. Have you passed by stories of missing black kids while paying rapt attention to a missing white girl? No, I can't say I have, although to be fair, I doubt I've ever had the opportunity to do so. Who goes looking for stories of missing kids to the point where they can skip some in favor of others? Have you ever thought or suggested that a black person was exaggerating their experience of racism? Yeah, certainly. I can't think of any specific examples, but given the current climate of people frequently faking or exaggerating claims of hate crimes, sexism, and racism, there's probably been a case where a black person claimed something was racist, and I felt they were exaggerating. I've never done this in person, but I don't share opinions on things like racism and sexism in person because I don't want to have my life ruined. Have most of your black friends been people whose families and friends you know little to nothing about? No, not any more than most of my other friends. I don't see what their race has to do with whether I'd know their family and friends, though. Have you ever caught yourself agreeing with the sentiments that blacks are more criminal than whites? I certainly don't think black people are inherently, by nature of their racial makeup, more criminal than whites. But statistically, in America, black people do tend to commit more crimes. I don't even think race is the main factor in that, and it's certainly not the causal factor. Have you ever felt more unsafe around a group of black kids than around a group of white kids in the same circumstance? No, I can't think of any time that's happened. Have you ever dismissed movies with predominantly black casts as black movies and not of general interest? Yeah. The ones marketed specifically at black people? Yeah, sure. But if a movie looks good and gets good reviews, I'd be willing to watch it regardless of who it's marketed towards. I mean, I don't watch Tyler Perry movies, not because they're black movies necessarily, but because they tend to get awful reviews, and they just don't look like the kind of movie I'd enjoy. Have you ever laughed at a black stereotype? I've watched a lot of comedy in my life, so yeah, probably. I've probably laughed at a stereotype of pretty much every race. I find absurdity to be funny. Laughing at something, though, doesn't mean that you approve of it or you agree with it. Have you ever been surprised that a black person was eloquent? Yep, there was one time I met a black guy who was dressed as a stereotypical gang member, and I was surprised when he turned out to be eloquent and intelligent, and we ended up getting along very well. That's called a learning experience, and it happened more than a decade ago. Since then, I've learned not to judge people as much by how they dress. Have you ever looked at a cop shooting an unarmed black person and thought, not my problem? Well, I've certainly never witnessed that happening. If you mean a case where that happened, yeah, I've thought it was not my problem when it happened in a place or circumstance where there's literally nothing I can do about it. I believe in not worrying about things you can't control. I am strongly opposed to excessive use of force by police, especially the use of deadly force, and I've spoken out about this many times, but I can't be everywhere at once, and I'm not interested in making police violence a racial issue more than it needs to be. Have you ever wished that black people would speak properly? I don't think speak properly is the way I'd phrase it, but I have felt that if more black people put an emphasis on being able to communicate clearly with people outside their community, they would be more successful in general. There are some unfortunate associations between black culture, which includes the way many black people speak, and things like gang violence and hedonism. So it's not surprising that many people have a negative reaction to people who express themselves in ways typical of that culture. I think, in general, the black community would benefit from not always communicating in that way. Have you ever presumed that you were smarter than a black person without evidence? I presume I'm smarter than most people, but that's not without evidence. Have you ever pointed to Obama as evidence of a post-racial society? No, I've never made that particular argument. Again, that's the kind of argument made by people who are using the common definition of the word racism, and they're arguing against the idea that America in general is a racist country. The logic is that if America was a racist country, Obama never would have been elected. Have you ever assumed that a black person got into a good school or job just because of affirmative action? Not specifically, but since affirmative action exists, it stands to reason that some black people will get such positions based solely on their race. And I don't really blame people if they harbor suspicions about who that might be in their school or organization. That's one of the reasons affirmative action is actually harmful and is something I oppose. Have you ever told a black person that if they just stopped talking about race, it wouldn't be so much of an issue? I've never suggested that to a specific black person, I don't think, But I have suggested that less focus on race would be a good thing for Black people in general. The main societal push a couple of decades ago was to move towards a society in which race didn't matter, where everyone could get along despite their racial differences. Songs like Black or White by Michael Jackson or the movie Remember the Titans are examples of that. But since then, there's been a shift towards emphasizing the differences between race and focusing on the negatives of race relations. And not surprisingly, race relations have been getting worse. I think we should shift back to that old message, and it would be better for everyone. Have you ever cringed at a family member dating a Black person? No, and I couldn't care less. Have you ever sat through offensive, racist jokes about Black people and said nothing or laughed along? Well, here's an interesting point. First off, offensive is a completely subjective term. Something offensive to you may not be offensive to me or to anyone else. And on top of that, does anyone laugh at jokes they personally find offensive? Generally, I think not. So let's ignore that part of the question and pretend you're just asking if I've ever laughed at racist jokes. Well, of course I have. Again, I find absurdity funny, and laughing or making jokes about something is not the same as supporting it or normalizing it. If racism was normal, it wouldn't be funny anymore. Have you ever found yourself thinking of Africa as a country? No, I have a pretty good grasp of geography, although African geography is not my strong suit. Have you ever insisted on your color blindness? No, I see race, if that's what you mean. I just don't see it as the most relevant factor most of the time. Have you ever felt the need to explain how racism works to a Black person? Is there something magical about the color of your skin that makes you an expert on how society and people in general work? I may know more about those topics than some Black people, and so I may be able to provide insight to such people that they otherwise might never think of. And to answer your question, yes, I've done it already in this video. Have you ever thought of Black history as separate or tangential to American history? Yep, and that's largely because for my entire life I've been hearing about Black History Month every year. If you want people to stop treating Black history as separate, then stop addressing it separately. Have you ever affected/mimed Black mannerisms in order to greet a new Black person? No, that would be weird. Have you ever responded to a Black person discussing the damage inflicted on them by racism and answered, "Not all white people"? I can't remember a specific case of doing so, but if I saw a Black person blaming all white people for the racism they've experienced, then I might try to point out that they're being unfair in their accusation. Have you found yourself concerned with proving that you passed this test? No, not really, because I don't see it as a valid test of racism for reasons I've already explained. I suspected from the beginning I'd fail the test, but I didn't agree with the implications you claim this test has, so it didn't matter. You probably didn't get through this without saying yes to at least one of these things, and that's okay. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just shows that we are all affected by anti-Black attitudes and teachings in America. If you did get through this without saying yes, remember that it's not an exhaustive list, and getting all no's doesn't make you immune to anti-Blackness. Except that for most, if not all of my yeses, it was not an actual example of racism, or it was an example that happened long ago and has not reoccurred. So, no, of course it doesn't make me a bad person. But it also doesn't really do a great job of proving we're all affected by anti-Black attitudes and teachings. You may feel guilt, you may feel defiance, you may feel superior, you may feel vindicated. These are all valid responses. But the point is self-reflection. Racism in America is not sustained by hate groups. It is sustained by everyday, good-hearted people who do not realize how deep anti-Black biases can be planted in our minds and our culture. What if I don't feel any of those things? Is that still valid? If anything, I feel disappointment. Surely there are better questions you could have asked to demonstrate to people that they have anti-Black attitudes. But that would have required being more specific, which would lower the number of false positives you get in response. See, I suspect that the purpose of these questions is to cause as many people as possible to think that they have some anti-Black attitudes. If you find yourself in this list, don't beat yourself up. Take an opportunity to confront those biases and encourage others to do the same. And there it is. What you seem to want is to convince people that they have racist ideas so that they'll take steps to correct those ideas and convince others to do the same. That would be fine, except you're not really using great examples of racism to convince people. So in the end, what's most likely to happen is naive, well-meaning white people will take the test, become convinced they're racist even though they're not, and then try to correct for biases and prejudices they don't have. That's not healthy, but it's good if your motive is to just further push your ideas about how racist America is. Now I'd like to offer a couple tips on how you could have improved this quiz. The first and most basic thing would be to change the questions from "have you ever" questions to something like, "in the past 6 months, have you done any of the following things?" And then you list off some of the actions a racist person might do, or someone who has anti-black attitudes might do. So you can keep a lot of these same examples, but make them current, make people say that, yes, I've done this recently, because that means it's beliefs they currently have, not beliefs they might have had when they were young and stupid. So that's the start. And the other thing I would use is more examples that are clear examples of anti-black attitudes. So you need to be much more specific and clear in your questions so that there's no ambiguity. People can't answer yes even though they haven't done anything with any kind of anti-black motivation or feeling involved. So most of the questions are not going to be able to be just one line like you have here. You're going to have to explain. Some of your questions might be a paragraph long, and that's okay, because when you're dealing with an issue like racism, you need to be as clear as you can, because the problem here is that quizzes like this that have obvious flaws, that seem to be designed to get false positives, what that does is it doesn't convince anybody. See, people who already buy into your ideology are going to look at this quiz and be like, hell yeah, I totally agree with this sentiment. You know, I have white guilt and I need to atone for that. People who don't agree with your ideology are going to look at this and say, well, this is bullshit, and not take any of it seriously. And it'll just push them further away from your ideology. And what needs to happen is people who have your ideology and people who have the opposite ideology and everyone in between needs to meet somewhere in the middle so that there can be actual conversations about race relations, because I'm not one of those people who is going to try and claim that there are no race problems, especially in America. There are race problems. There are people that have messed up attitudes about it. There are people who have stereotypical beliefs, who have wrong ideas, who are racist. And the way to solve that is not the way you're trying to do it here. This is not the most effective way of solving it, because you need to be able to convince the people who don't share all your beliefs. And the way to do that is to be clear, to communicate well, and to be honest. And if you can't do that, then you're just going to make the situation worse, not better. Anyway, I plan to link you this response on Twitter. If you genuinely want to have a rational conversation about anything I've said here, I'm happy to do so. And that goes for anyone else watching this. Until next time, I'm Positive Improvement, and I wish you all the best.